So we're able to collect those user credentials, the email address and the password. Now we want to send that data to Firebase. And we can send it to Firebase through Firebase official authentication REST API. So in the end, by using certain URLs exposed by Firebase that are meant to be used to send such credentials and to ensure that Firebase stores such credentials. We could send HTTP requests, as you learned it earlier in the course, to Firebase, to specific URLs defined by Firebase with specific data attached to it to create users or to sign users in. That all works and could be done, but I'm not going to send HTTP requests like this. I am still going to send HTTP requests because the communication between frontend and backend always happens through HTTP in the end, but I'm not going to create and send and handle those HTTP requests manually, but instead in this section here, we're going to use the Firebase SDK for that. And that, of course, brings up one important question. What is such an SDK and why would we use it? In the end, a SDK is a software development kit, and in the end, it's basically just again a collection of code you can use in your code, just as Flutter in the end is a collection of code you can use in your Dart projects, to, in Firebase case, talk to the Firebase services. And you would use such an SDK to make your life as a developer a bit easier. Because configuring, sending, and handling HTTP requests manually can be cumbersome, especially when working with a complex service like Firebase, and that's why many third-party services like Firebase do offer such SDKs, such pre-built code packages that simplify the process of working with them. As mentioned, you don't have to use that SDK. You could use Firebase REST API to send HTTP requests to certain URLs manually. And if you, for example, did build your own backend, you also wouldn't have such an SDK unless you built one yourself. But for many third-party services like Firebase, such SDKs exists, and being able to use them and making your life as a developer easier is something you should be able to do. And that's why we're going to use that Firebase SDK in this course section here. Also because we will not just be using Firebase for authentication, but later also for uploading and storing images and for sending push notifications and more. Now you can simply search for Firebase Flutter SDK to learn more about how to add this SDK to your Flutter project. And at the moment, all we have to do to use this SDK is to first install the Firebase CLI, the Firebase command line interface, which is an extra tool you can install on your system, no matter which operating system you're using, to interact with Firebase and to, for example, help with that SDK installation process. Though it's worth noting that that CLI is not the SDK, instead it's another extra tool provided by Firebase to make working with Firebase features like that SDK a bit easier on your system. And here I'll go to macOS, but of course you should choose your platform. And here for me, I'm going to install that SDK by using npm, since I have Node.js installed on my system. Though you can, of course, use any of these options to make sure that you do install that Firebase CLI. Ultimately, it will just be important that in the end you will have that CLI installed. So here I'll install it by running this command, but this will only work if you have Node.js on your system. And once you did finish that Firebase CLI installation process, which you can confirm by running Firebase in your system terminal or command prompt, and if you then don't get an error, but instead some output that looks like this, you will know that Firebase was installed. So once you did do that, once you did install this Firebase CLI, we can proceed with the second step here on that Firebase SDK page now again, and log into our Firebase, so in the end into our Google account here, by running Firebase login. Now this might prompt you for your email address and password, allowing you to log into your Google account through that CLI. And once you did that, we can run this command here to install the Flutter Fire CLI, which is yet another extra tool provided by Firebase, which will specifically be used for managing Flutter projects with Firebase and for adding Firebase features to Flutter projects. But since this Flutter Fire CLI uses the Firebase CLI under the hood, we need to install both the Firebase CLI and then the Flutter Fire CLI by running this command. And I know that's a lot of tools and a lot of CLIs, but you only need to do this once ever on your system, and thereafter you will be able to use Firebase and this Flutter Fire CLI in any Flutter project, not just in the one we're currently working on. So here I'll now run this command to install this Flutter Fire CLI on my system. And this can of course all take a while. But once this is done, we can go back to our Flutter project finally and run this command in that project using that Flutter Fire CLI that we did just install to configure this Flutter project for using Firebase. Now, if you're getting an error that in the end tells you that the Flutter Fire command wasn't found, you might want to run that command that in the end installed the Flutter Fire CLI again, because in there you should then see a warning that in the end tells you that right now you might have an issue with your path setup, hence basically leading to the Flutter Fire command not being available. And it should also show you a fix for that, so that for example here on my system, which is a macOS system, I should add this line here to my terminal configuration file, which here on my system, on macOS, in the end is this set as HRC file, which I'll just open with text edit, and then in there I'll add this line that was shown to me in the terminal. Again, you should see the specific instructions you need for your system in your terminal or command prompt when running that dart pub global activate Flutter Fire CLI command. With that fixed here, if I now close this terminal and then reopen it, effectively opening a new one, I should now be able to run Flutter Fire configure in my Flutter project here. And this now in the end walks us through the setup process for this Flutter project to use Firebase in there and to add that Firebase SDK. And again, you only need to go through all these steps once, which is why it takes some time now, but it won't take that long for future Flutter projects. You will always have to run Flutter Fire configure when you're in a new Flutter project and you want to add the Firebase SDK to it, but you won't have to go through all these general setup steps again.